Bonjour à tous. Je vous propose d'enchaîner rapidement puisqu'on a pris un petit peu de retard sur la dernière conférence. Merci pour ceux qui sont restés et à ceux qui arrivent. La prochaine conférence portera sur faire de la résilience de la supply un avantage compétitif. Et on a la chance pour cette conférence d'accueillir Nicolas Bouvet, qui est Retail Supply Chain and Operations Lead for Europe chez Accenture. Il aura le plaisir de détailler un petit peu sa mission. Et on accueille également David Simchi Levi, qui est professeur au MIT. Je vous laisse démarrer tous les deux et merci pour votre attention.
Bonjour. So I will switch in English. That's a real pleasure to be here with you today. For us, this is a great opportunity to share a point of view that we developed. So let me... Today we want to discuss around resiliency. So it has been quite of a challenge to go there. You know, this is consulting, working with academics. And this is always a bit of a love and hate kind of story. Consultants think that academics are not on earth, but academics think that consulting is a bit bullshitting. But here we want to go beyond that. We want to go beyond the buzz. We want to share real story, a method, and we'll have a video to go in some details around resiliency. So on my side, as explained, I'm Nicolas Bouvet. I'm managing director leading all the retail, fashion, luxury, grocery operations within Accenture for Europe. And so this is a pleasure to introduce also David.
Thank you, Nicolas. Welcome, everybody. I'm David Simchi Levi. I'm on the faculty at MIT. A little bit about myself. I have been in academia for a long time, just on the faculty at MIT for the last 22 years. But in parallel to being an academic, I started a few companies. One company was in supply chain analytics, a company that became part of IBM in 2009. At that time, we had about 350 clients using our technology. And then in the last 12 years, I started two companies, one in business analytics and one in cloud technology. Both companies became part of Accenture over the last couple of years. I'm now company free. I'm not selling you anything. But I will talk about work that we have done at the MIT Data Science Lab. At the MIT Data Science Lab that I lead, we have a partnership with about 25 companies focusing on some of the most challenging problems that these companies have by bringing together data, models, and analysis. One of the major areas of research that we have focused on is supply chain resiliency. We started focusing on supply chain resiliency way before the pandemic. Now there is a lot of interest in resiliency. We started focusing on supply chain resiliency after events like the tsunami in Japan and the flood in Thailand in 2011, or if you remember the volcano eruption in Iceland in 2010, an event that affected supply chain in multiple industries, from the automotive to the high-tech. We were fortunate to collaborate with the Ford Motor Company, starting from 2012, develop a new way to measure, to quantify the level of resiliency in Ford supply chain, identify hidden risk, and develop mitigation strategies. We reported the results of this collaboration, the new framework, the impact on Ford, in a paper that, you cannot see it, the yellow Harvard Business Review that was published in 2014. This technology won the best technology at Ford Motor Company among all the technologies that the company implemented. Between 2014 and the beginning of the pandemic, I was knocking on many doors, trying to convince companies to focus on supply chain resiliency. Very little interest. Most companies focus on supply chain efficiency, using strategies like lean, like outsourcing, like offshoring, to cut costs from their supply chain. We had about 10 companies in a variety of industry, from food to fashion retailing to aerospace, using our technology, but not much interest. Everything changed at the beginning of the pandemic, but perhaps not in the way you expect. Remember January 2020. The pandemic was in China. It was not in Europe, and it was not in North America. I started collecting data in January 2020 on what's happening in China, and I realized that I can use the technologies that I developed 6 years earlier to understand the impact of what's happening in China on global supply chain, on supply chain in North America and in Europe. And very quickly, I published a paper, the one at the top right-hand side, on Harvard Business Review in February of 2020, saying in the first paragraph that supply chain in North America and in Europe will stop by mid-March. And this is exactly what happened. If you look at publication, at articles, at journals, published in March 17 and March 18, they reported the automotive industry in Europe was shutting down. The automotive industry in the US was shutting down. And this is not just the automotive industry. And we got enormous interest in our technology after that publication. 2 months later, in February of 2020, I published the third article in Harvard Business Review, where I said we need to apply supply chain stress test for critical supply chain, and I enumerated what are the critical supply chain: food, healthcare, life science, semiconductor. And I said in that piece, we don't need to look far. The technology, the model, the framework are all here for companies to use. I was pleased to see that in the US President Economic Report of this year, published in April of this year, the economic report has a section calling companies to use the supply chain resiliency stress test that came out of my lab at MIT. In May of 2020, so remember in February, we predicted that supply chain will stop by mid-March. In April, we made a call for companies to use stress tests. And in May of 2020, Accenture signed a big contract with MIT to scale our technology to multiple industries. And this is what we are going to focus on today. We will report on the technologies that came out of this partnership between Accenture and MIT and give you an insight on implementation in multiple industries, from automotive to CPG to food supply chain to fashion retailing. And hopefully you will get some insight about the potential impact of this type of technology. Nicolas.
Thank you, David. So what is it that we want to do? We want to turn resiliency into a competitive advantage. let's start defining what this resiliency is. This is the ability for a company to be able to absorb, to adapt, and to recover from a disruptive event. Okay, and we want to do that at minimal cost and faster, because there is, you know, this competition across all the companies. So this is the end game. Now, let's start from those disruptions. This is just evidence for everybody. If I just have a look at the last 2 years on those disruptions, and then we'll see that this is just the new normal. So it started with the COVID. Then from the COVID, we had the cheap manufacturing elements. We had the transportation cost in the maritime. We were lacking a number of carriers. Then there is the Russian-Ukraine war. We see the impact on the price of oil, of gas. So here again, this is never-ending. If we just have a look at the United Nations for the climatic events, they are saying that this is today 4 events a year, and tomorrow it will be 600. So again, here this is the new normal. So we have to build the capabilities to be able to manage that in a new normal way. So let's have a look at a company that has implemented that and to listen from what they said. So here this is an automotive company. This is around 15 billion with operation across the globe. And they implemented this resiliency capability 2 years ago. This is the feedback of the CEO. And here there are 4 messages. First one, this is the CEO, and he's saying that this ability is across the operations. So this is breaking the silos. This is the first message. So across supply chain, manufacturing, procurement, logistics, etc. We are breaking the silos. The second one is to say that to have this capability, you need to be able to navigate within the technology, the data, the algorithm. Okay, so this is a digital capability that you need to have, and in the rest of the presentation, we're going to highlight this element. Third thing is that this is not a Friday's afternoon job. This is, a capability that you need to do that will last. So you need to have a dedicated team. So this company, they have implemented a dedicated team to manage this resiliency. And then the last thing is that this is a competitive advantage for them. Now the CEO is pitching that to its customers to be able to tell them, please buy my products because I have the ability to react very quickly if there is an event. So this is really one way to differentiate for them.
All right. So I'll take you into the detail of supply chain resiliency, but just to put it in perspective, in supply chain resiliency, there are 4 different levels. If you look at this slide, at the bottom, you see the assessment level. In the assessment level, what we are trying to answer is a simple question. How is my supply chain able to respond to a disruption anywhere in my network? The ability to answer this question, the assessment level question, allow us to identify hidden risk and then develop mitigation strategies. And this is what we do at the strategic level. At the strategic level, we implement flexibility, redundancy, inventory to make sure that we increase the resiliency of our supply chain. Of course, flexibility redundancy do not come free. And so it's important to identify where and how much redundancy I need, where and how much flexibility I need. The same technology that help us with the assessment, help us identify and answer the questions at the strategic level. At the tactical level, it's all about monitoring risk exposure. Week to week, risk exposure is changing. Why risk exposure is changing? Because lead time are increasing. Perhaps because inventory depleted much faster than expected. What you want is a technology that allow you to identify changes in risk exposure. Nothing is wrong, but you want to make sure that you quantify the level of risk exposure in your supply chain, much like in financial market, a company like Goldman Sachs identifies their financial risk exposure on a daily basis. For a lot of our companies, and our clients and our partners, this is what they do with the same technologies that we will describe here on a weekly basis. And finally, at the operational level, we want to use the technology to respond to a disruption. Earthquake in Thailand, shutting down a supplier manufacturing facility. I want to understand this event that happened today, when it will hit my supply chain in Europe or my supply chain in North America. If I know today that I will have a problem 6, 7, 8 weeks from now, I can take mitigation strategy before everybody else, capture additional capacity, and better respond to the event. And so I'm going to take you through the technologies that allow us to address the 4 levels of risk management in supply chain. But before I present the key concept, the key framework, the key KPI, it's important to give you a summary of the key insight. And the insight that you see on this slide came out of implementation in many different companies in a variety of industries. The first insight is that implementing resiliency allows you to be way more competitive in the market. At the end of the presentation, I'll show you statements from companies you know very well, where their CEO talk about the ability of resiliency to turn their supply chain into a competitive advantage. So think about it differently. Resiliency, much like lean, is a philosophy. Because of this, companies need to balance efficiency, which is all about cost, with resiliency and business performance. And this implies investing in a digital twin, investing in mapping your supply chain, and using new KPIs that we typically don't use when you manage our supply chain. These KPIs are TTR, which stands for time to recover, TTS, which stands for time to survive, and PI, which stands for performance impact. I will explain in detail in the next couple of slides what each KPI allows us to achieve. And finally, you will see that the digital twin and the new KPI allow us to identify hidden risk in the supply chain and therefore design mitigation strategies. One way to explain the framework, the model, the KPI is to use the example of the Ford Motor Company. What you see on the slide is a simplified version of Ford supply chain. Just a little bit about Ford supply chain. I know this is a retail conference. Lots of the technology and the insights that I'm going to report here, we found the same in retail, in food supply chain, in fashion retailing, as well as in CPG manufacturing companies. Here is a simplified version of Ford supply chain. On the right-hand side, you see the assembly plants. Tier 1 suppliers include many suppliers, about 6,000 suppliers. There are many tiers of supply. that you need to include in this type of analysis. In this supply chain, there are about 60,000 different components that flow between the different facilities. And this supply chain, just in North America, is responsible for the production of 6 to 7 million cars every year. So a disruption in this supply chain will have enormous impact on bottom line. When we met with the Ford leadership discussing supply chain resiliency, the question that they asked, where should we invest our resources in terms of mitigation strategies? Procurement at Ford had an answer. Their intuition, their experience suggested that Ford should invest and focus on strategic suppliers. Who are the strategic suppliers? Strategic suppliers are suppliers where Ford invests huge amount of money with every year. The leadership at Ford asked us, is this true? Or maybe risk is hidden in unexpected places and we need to look elsewhere. To answer these questions, I want to introduce a few KPI. The first one is what I call time to recover, or TTR. Let me explain time to recover. Look at the chemical supplier in the middle of the left-hand side. Look at the chemical supplier and try to identify how long it takes the chemical supplier to respond to a disruption. This chemical supplier told us that their time to recover is about 2 weeks. Why is it 2 weeks? Because today they provide us with chemical from a facility in China. If this facility in China is disrupted, they can switch production and ramp up capacity in a facility in Singapore, and it takes about 2 weeks. And in a similar fashion, we collect data on time to recover for other facilities. Now, there are many supply chain people in this audience, and immediately you have a few questions. The first one is that time to recover is clearly scenario dependent. And there is a limit to my ability to identify all the relevant scenarios. The second one, if I connect with a supplier, trying to understand the supplier time to recover, the supplier is going to be optimistic. They know that if they tell us that their time to recover is 6 months, it's a big problem. So how do I validate information collected from my, perhaps, tier 1 suppliers? I will answer that question in a few minutes. But assume that we've validated information about time to recover. If I have that information, I can calculate performance impact. What is performance impact? I am going to remove the chemical supplier from the supply chain for the duration of time to recover for 2 weeks and ask, what is the financial or operational impact of a disruption in this supplier? For example, we will estimate what is the impact of a disruption at the chemical supplier, you can see here, for 2 weeks on Ford bottom line, on Ford revenue. And the model that started with detailed supply chain mapping allow us to estimate that if this supplier is disrupted for 2 weeks, the impact on revenue will be a loss of about $400 million. In a similar fashion, we can estimate the impact on lost profit, lost market share, or lost production, which will be an operational impact. Given these two concepts, let me now show you data straight from the Ford system. On the left-hand side, you see a screenshot from the system where bubbles represent tier 1 suppliers. Remember, there are 6,000 tier 1 suppliers. On the Y coordinate, I am providing information about total spend by Ford at each one of the suppliers annually. Just inspecting this figure, you can see that the strategic suppliers are all at the top. These are the suppliers that Ford spend huge amount of money with every year. On the X coordinate, I am showing you performance impact. And here, Ford measure performance impact by looking at lost profit. Just by inspecting this figure, you realize that the strategic suppliers, if I can use this, the strategic supplier at the top, expose Ford to moderate risk. It's not the highest risk. The highest risk suppliers are all at the bottom right-hand side. I love this guy. I love this one. This is a tiny supplier that provides Ford with components that cost 20 cents. But if supply is disrupted, huge impact on bottom line. That's why we highlighted that risk in supply chain is hidden in unexpected places. Just focusing on intuition and experience may take us in the wrong direction. Let me give a second example. Here is a screenshot from the system implemented at the Ford Motor Company. What you see here are tier 1 suppliers by location for the North America assembly plants. You can see that for the North America assembly plants, Ford has suppliers in North America, in Europe, and in Asia. Each bubble represents a tier 1 supplier. The size of the bubble is proportional to risk that each one is exposing the company to. And you can see risky suppliers are really everywhere. They are in Asia, they are in Europe, and they are in North America. In the US, there is a notion that if you just move manufacturing activities and supplier facilities closer to market demand, you guarantee resiliency. This is not consistent with our data. And this is actually what happened during the first year of COVID. If you think about the food industry in the US, it's mostly domestic. Think about meat and pork, completely domestic. But this industry, the pork and meat industry, went through dramatic consolidation to cut cost. Everybody was thinking this is resilient supply chain. But when one of the facilities was just shut down because of COVID, huge supply shortage for meat and pork in North America. That's why I highlight just focusing on Asian supplier may take you in the wrong direction. Just focusing, for example, on strategic supplier may miss the biggest risk in your supply chain. Now let me go back to the question that I asked earlier. I asked a very simple question. Is there a measure of resiliency that is completely independent of scenario and completely independent of response from a specific supplier? TTR is scenario dependent. TTR requires information from the supplier, but the supplier may be optimistic. For that reason, we introduce what I call time to survive. What is time to survive? Think about the following example. Remember the Ford supply chain? Remove a facility, a supplier from the supply chain and ask, how long can I match supply with demand without that supplier? It's not zero, because the pipeline is full with inventory, but I can estimate this time. Why? Because I started with supply chain mapping. Here is data on Ford Tier 1 supplier time to survive. You can see on the X coordinate is time to survive in weeks. So on the left-hand side, you can see 1 day time to survive, 2 days, all the way to 1 week, then 10 days, 12 days. Then we have suppliers and components whose time to survive is 2 weeks, 10 weeks, 50 weeks. Ford had component whose time to survive is 60 weeks, 80 weeks, 90 weeks. Just inspecting this slide suggests a challenge and an opportunity. And this is data straight from Ford system. Why this slide suggests a challenge and an opportunity? Because on the left-hand side, you see all the components whose time to survive is 1 day, 2 days, 3 days. I don't care what the supplier is telling me. I know these are risky suppliers. Why on the right-hand side I have an opportunity? I have here component for which time to survive is 80 weeks, 90 weeks, 100 weeks. Why is it so long? Because Ford invested in a lot of inventory, significant level of redundancy. These are expensive. If I just cut inventory by 30%, I will still have a very long time to survive, but I am able to cut my cost significantly. That's why in Insight 3, I emphasize those facilities and components whose time to survive is short is where we need to focus on. On the other hand, those components with time to survive that are very long provide us with significant saving opportunities. Let me summarize this part by highlighting that in order to quantify the level of resiliency of your supply chain, you need to understand financial impact of a disruption. And you need to look around the corner. That is to say, risk is hidden in unexpected places. And to do that, you need to invest in supply chain mapping, in a digital twin, and use different KPI. Use time to recover, time to survive, and performance impact. And if you look at the right-hand side, you see 2 statements from companies that are using that technology and are willing to talk about the impact. The first one is Ford Executive VP for Product Development and Purchasing. This statement was made before the pandemic. In 2018, he said, if you can do this type of analysis, the one that I just described, across your supply chain, you can learn how to prioritize and manage risk effectively. The second quote is from Annette Clayton. Annette Clayton is the CEO and president of Schneider Electric North America. At the beginning of the pandemic, Annette Clayton took her team to MIT, and we implemented the resiliency measures that I just described. September 2021, September of last year, Annette Clayton was in a big supply chain summit in Chicago. Here is what she said. She said, everybody is suffering from the disruption and the impact of COVID, but we are doing better than anybody else. We are suffering too, but we are doing better than anybody else because we are able to identify potential problems before they hit our supply chain. And here is what she said. Leverage digitization. You can automate these processes. This is what Nicolas will describe. And use concepts like time to recover, time to survive, and this will help you keep your business and growth healthy and keep your customers and shareholders happy. Nicolas.
Thanks, David. I'm a big fan of the slide with the bubbles. It's really, really impressive. So what is the path? How to implement that? I'm a consultant, so 3 steps. The first one is super quick. This is to have the maturity. So just in a matter of a few weeks with an online tool, with some interviews, the idea is to know where you stand on the resiliency. Second step, an important one, here this is setting the digital twin. So we're going to detail that, but again, the idea here is to be able to model the end-to-end network, the end-to-end operation supply chain from the stores to the supplier. On that, this is the third step, we are applying the stress test. So here we're going to define a number of business scenarios, spike in demand, issue with supplier, etc. And we will see the impact. when we identify some weak points, here we'll define the actions to be able to manage those weak points. Okay?